For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host Jade Black and today I'm here to talk about the oddest drafting experience I've ever had. It's just profoundly weird to think about this, and it's not a particular facet or part of the draft, it's the entire experience of this draft has been incredibly odd. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about this because I've talked a lot about experimentation and being a multi-genre writer and talked a fair bit about my process of writing first drafts, how I handwrite, how I have video games or music and sort of interactions I have with all that. And, writing linearly and all of these things I've talked about. But I haven't ever really had a process in any draft that's felt so profoundly odd, and that's even without actually experimenting in the process that much. But I do want to talk a bit first about all the different experiments I've done, because at points that has been odd as well, and I think it's important to set a ground level so you can get the distinction for this one I've just had. So the first things first is plotting versus pantsing. This is something I've talked about a fair bit and how I have experimented with this before, how I used to be a hardcore plotter and made the switch to going completely the other way, being a hardcore pantser, because I didn't enjoy plotting that much and I didn't really enjoy what happened as a result of plotting, but that's more about concept quality than anything else. I don't think the ideas I had when I plotted things out and the ideas I was working from in the first place were particularly great. I don't really have anything to show for this. Back from my plotting days, nothing has really survived that at all. When I think about the old bank of work of short stories from when I first started seriously writing and, all of the stuff I wrote back then, I really struggle to think of a single one that I actually plotted. There's a wealth of material from them, but I don't really still have very much of it. And that is why. And this whole idea of not enjoying drafting is something I've experienced very recently. This is part of the reason why this most recent drafting experience has been so odd, is because I just haven't enjoyed it. But it's not quite the same. With plotting, when I used to plot things, I didn't enjoy things because I got bored knowing what was going to happen. That was a big problem, but also I felt really frustrated more than anything because I felt that I was missing something and that there was missing potential, and that was more just frustrating and irritating than anything else. This latest experience isn't even that, it's just not been fun. It got to a point where I just genuinely was not having any fun with it, and that I just haven't experienced before. I've written drafts of things that are bad, I've gotten halfway through things that are really long and scrapped them because I didn't think they were good enough, and tried to write in poetry formats and all sorts that I haven't particularly enjoyed or felt frustrated by, but actively just not having fun at all, I haven't experienced before. And I think another very key point of experimentation that I actually tested really thoroughly over the years is the idea of drafting linearly versus jumping around and doing what people seem to call a Frankendraft. And it's no secret that I do draft extremely linearly now. I've talked about that many a time. But I did test this thoroughly, and actually, the first time I really did this long form was with the first of the determined ones that I drafted, which was Dead Penstemons. This was a Frankendraft, and I've talked about this before, but not for a while. It was a complete and utter mess. It's probably the fastest novel draft I've ever done, and not close. But stars above, was it a mess? And I actually tried this again because eventually Black Executioner ate at me enough that I decided to write it. And I wrote Black Executioner alongside another project that never really got named. For intents and purposes here, it's Melraki, that was the name of the main character. And Black Executioner I drafted linear, start to finish. Melraki, at the same time, I Frankendrafted. And let's just say there's a reason why one of them has a name and one of them doesn't. You know, one of them was conceptually extremely flawed and actually had a good starting point, so... And it was a mess, and it was... I never opened it again. It's that simple. At the end of the day, I never opened it again. But this is a very unique case because I don't actually think it's a bad process, and I don't think it worked badly. Meraki was done way before Black Executioner was. I'm not convinced I was even halfway into Black Executioner when Meraki was done. That's the thing. It's really, really quick, and it doesn't always give you a great draft. I mean, Penstemons, when you draw the comparison between the two that I've Frankendrafted, isn't that bad. And I don't think the actual original 90k draft, when I decided I'd done enough drafting, I actually don't think that was that bad still. I think back then I still didn't really know how to edit, and I made it a lot worse from where it originally was. The other one, I will say, was a bad draft. It was a complete and utter mess as a first draft, and it was a pain in the arse. But again, I don't think it's always a bad process. I think, for me, it's been unreliable, which is, to be honest, more the problem. But during drafting, it's fine. It's an editing issue more than anything. It's just that it takes so much longer to edit, and it's so annoying in edits, because I know it doesn't have to be like that. Because again, this isn't how I started. Frankendrafting was something that I saw other people doing and thought was a good idea because everyone said it was faster, and it is, in the drafting stage. It takes so much longer in edits that taking the hit and doing the linear draft is orders of magnitude faster overall for me. You know, this is going to be something that varies a lot for different people. I know a lot of people Frankendraft really, really well. Props to you, I don't understand how, fundamentally, but they do. But this was a thing for me that I was actually quite reluctant to give up because it was so quick in the drafting stages, and I thought that was worth it. But over time and experience, I've decided it's not. Again, it's not a bad process, and it's more of an editing thing, but at no point did I not enjoy it. It was just a lot more work. And to be honest, I think having a tidier draft for me is easier. I find it much easier to do as little in edits as possible. Because when I'm drafting, I'm living and breathing it in a way that when I'm editing, I'm just not. So you might be wondering at this point, which project has it been that I have just fundamentally not enjoyed writing? And if you've been around the podcast for a while, this title will be very familiar to you. It's hypoxemia. I have talked about hypoxemia a lot on this podcast. From the initial conceptualization stage, I've talked about it. It was the World in a Day episode was hypoxemia. But in case you're new here, and it has actually been a fair bit since I've mentioned this, a hypoxemia is a novelette. It's epic fantasy, and it's a good versus evil type story. And dear God, I hated it. I do. I hated drafting it. And even from the beginning, looking back on it now, I've had a few days to reflect having finished it. And at the beginning, I didn't really love it. And that isn't unusual for me. I struggle with beginnings, partly because, it's just coming to something completely and utterly cold with absolutely minimal information. It's quite hard to start. But also, at this point, I know now that my beginnings are rough. And they always need the most edits, and that can be quite an irritating process. So starting can be not fun because I know it's not the standard it should be, or it could be, or I want it to be. I just know it's not all there. So not enjoying the very start of a project isn't particularly unusual, and I didn't really think about that very much at the time. But that sort of level of quiet sort of dissatisfaction and just sort of feeling lackluster about the entire thing never went away. Usually that lifts very, very, very quickly. But that kept going for a while, and then it got to probably about a third of the way through, and I just really didn't want to write it anymore. It got to the point where it felt like pulling teeth, and not in the same way that Snakebite did, where it was difficult to write, but it was so satisfying. It's like it was really difficult, but it was satisfying enough that I always felt really good when I was writing or when I finished a session. That never happened here. It was just pulling teeth, and it got to the point later on where I was just like, where writing was starting to make me angry, because it was just so profoundly not enjoyable as an experience. It was not fun in really any sense. I didn't like the story that much either. And part of me was really disappointed in that, because I think, and I still do believe this, and I did at the time, that it's actually a good concept for what it is, and it is fresh and unique, but I wasn't feeling any of those things in the moment. But I do think there's still value in there, and I do like the core ideas that I have, but actually getting that on the page, I just really haven't enjoyed at any stage. And I've sort of come to two big things that I think have really gotten in the way of that. And it's actually not that it's a fantasy story. I don't know that that really impacts it very much at all. I think the biggest factor, and this has been present since the beginning, and at every point I've gotten stuck in any point in it, conceptually at all points, this has been a real bugbear of mine, and that is that it's a good versus evil story. I really wanted to write as pure as possible good versus evil story to see if I could. But this has impacted almost every single part of the story, and more for me for not seeing that coming. Honestly, that's kind of dumb on my part, but it really did affect so much more than I thought it would. First and foremost, the villain. And it's worth noting that it's pretty rare for me to consider that I actually have a full-on villain in a story. And again, that's part of the reason I wanted to write this, was to write a true out-and-out villain. It's pretty rare for me to consider that I have this, because usually what I think of as an antagonist is either not necessarily even a person. In Mr. Nakagami, the antagonist is not a conscious, alive entity. It's not an entity that has any kind of consciousness or any kind of thoughts. So it's hard for me to say that that's a villain, because to me, villain implies malice. It implies a level of innate malice and or cruelty. And it's hard for me to me, that's a pretty high threshold to hit. Because even someone like Akio in Black Executioner as an antagonist, he's a horrible man, but it's impossible to ignore that he's also being used. So to truly call him a villain when he's being taken advantage of, I find quite difficult. And again, the intention behind a villain has to be something that is, particularly in the case of a good versus evil story, not so much in a more complex story, but it has to be something that is out and out immoral, that there isn't really a good justification for. And again, I rarely feel like I have this. So trying to create a character like that was really difficult, actually, even coming to a completely blank slate. Someone who is just completely and utterly reprehensible, not justifiable, like Golden, not justifiable really in any kind of a way, was quite difficult to do, and I actually quite enjoyed that at many points, but the idea that I couldn't really have many, if any, redeeming qualities I found frustrating, because it's kind of odd, because I like a good versus evil story. I do. I really like Twilight Princess as a Zelda game is very much a good versus evil story. I really enjoy that. But trying to create that wasn't so fun, because I felt like I was sort of missing something. Like I missed that complex character in an antagonist. And I think there are ways you can do that, but in the context I was trying to get of this pure as possible good versus evil, I didn't really feel there was room for that. And the other thing that really annoyed me, I think this is the thing that spurred me to do this episode, was how much this affected the ending. Because I'd actually been really looking forward to the ending. I thought I had a really solid ending. It was one of the first things I knew, which probably didn't help with me not enjoying the process. Going back to the plotting points I was making earlier, that probably really didn't help. But I actually I didn't feel, end it exactly how I wanted to. Because I cut the ending a scene early. And that just annoyed me so much, because I feel the ending is satisfying, but it's not the one I wanted, and I am not satisfied with how much simpler everything is for it. It really annoys me, actually. And basically the reason I cut this scene is because it's a good versus evil story. The good has triumphed over the evil. And in a story like that, to then end on a bitter note, because it would have been, just felt wrong. And again, if there had been more complexity throughout, maybe I could have done that. Maybe I could have felt that I'd done that I could do that. But as it stood at the time, I didn't feel I could do that, and I still don't. Because this is the whole thing. is the complexity in something like this just felt lacking to me. I'm used to writing very complex scenarios with complex characters who have a whole lot of backstory and motivations and justifications and perspectives that end up butting heads, but no one's necessarily wrong. A very obvious example of this is Haru and Hanzo. They end up butting heads, but neither one of them is wrong. And to me, that's the part of a story that I love most as a reader and as a writer, is when you have that complexity, when you have that tension that can't ever resolve. I love stuff like that. I really like that complexity, that level of detail that you can keep diving into eternally. And the more situations like that, the better. I love political thrillers because of stuff like this, that there is often no good choice, and you have to make do with what's pragmatically possible to do. And you're going to face hate for it anyway, and some probably pretty dire consequences, but you do the best with what you can, and someone is going to come to you very angry and they're going to be completely 100% right. And you're going to have to just say to them, look, you don't know everything. And this is just what we had to do. And even if they understand, they're still going to be angry at you. And in a good versus evil story, and a short one at that, and I think that's partly the key as well, is that this is novelette length, not novel length. You know, it's a third of that. Although, actually, I think this one came in at 15k, so a fifth. There just isn't room for that in a story that is primarily good versus evil, and I was just really disappointed that I couldn't do any of that. It just felt like such a shame, and almost like a signature part of what I do as a writer just wasn't and couldn't be there. I think a really interesting part as well of the good versus evil is how it affects the good, the good guys. You have this much more reprehensible antagonist in a villain, someone who is just awful. And then you need the heroes to be at that same standard. They have to be even more heroic, even more noble than you'd usually get. And again, this is not typical for me. I know people are going to say, excuse me, Haru and Mr. Nakagami. Yes, Haru is an adorable cinnamon roll. He is a lovely, lovely man. But he still has to make horrible choices, and does without as much hesitation as you'd necessarily think at a couple of points. And there are a couple of points in the last chapter where I'm like, okay, that's a bit darker from you, Haru. I didn't expect you to be like that. Skirting around spoilers. I'm sure everybody who's read that, if you've gotten to the end of Mr. Nakagami and read the last chapter, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. But that's even someone like Haru, the sort of protagonists I often write are people like Hanzo, who is, well, I mean, he's Hanzo. He is this conniving, calculating politician with a heart of gold. I mean, that's who he is. Or someone like Shinichi, who is ruthless and bloodthirsty, but very much doing the right thing. But he has some really difficult character traits to balance with that. And all of this manifests in the side character, the sort of main side character, who I would call the sidekick. And, just for my own sanity, her name is Hadija, as it stands. And I couldn't make her... The way I had to handle her was interesting, because I had her set up from the start as being this, strong woman, this sort of badass, but she's also quite tactless, but it's not tactless, it's more just that she's kind of abrasive and doesn't really care. Like, she says some things that are just kind of out of line, and if you don't like it, that's very much your problem, not her problem. So when it came to writing the final boss fight, for want of better phrasing, I guess just the climax, she had to be the most heroic person in that moment, because she has the most sort of, in quotes, negative character traits. She then has to be even more of a hero to overcome that, so she's not just the weird asshole in the hero group in this good versus evil story. It sort of muddies that, it makes it weird. And that was not something I really thought about until that particular moment, because she was already such a big character and did so much just sort of naturally, because she was the second main character to enter the picture, that balance was already there. But I did think after the fact, well, that's sort of interesting that she has to do so much more just to keep hitting the hero threshold, because the villain threshold becomes so high. In a good versus evil story, with an out-and-out villain, the hero threshold has to match. So that was sort of interesting to balance. And again, I didn't really like that, actually, because it felt forced. It starts to sound, from even just hearing myself talk about it, it starts to sound like craft book stuff. You know how I feel about craft books on here. It starts to sound like, oh no, you can't really have flawed characters without them being... And I just hate that. I really, really do. I really hate that, because I was hoping that she wouldn't have to, that she would end up doing a bit less so that other characters could take the spotlight a bit more. But I didn't feel I could do that, preserving the true core idea of what the story is meant to be. Now, the vast majority of the time I write first person. I've talked about that many a time. And I've talked about writing third person, how I struggle with what I call camera placement. How close is the camera? Is there an omniscient narrator? Is this third person limited close? What is it? I really struggle with this. This is an experience thing. I've written so little third that it takes me a while to find where I want the camera to be, and it's a story by story basis. Where do I want it? That's something I find very difficult. I think it's partly an experience thing, it's partly a start of project thing. But the thing I found most annoying, and again this felt like a bit of a signature part of what I do, just couldn't be there, was the loss of the stream of consciousness. Because this is something that I do, and I've had to tone down a bit with some projects at some points because it's just a bit much at points, is this whole idea of the stream of consciousness and the blurring of the line at points between internal thought and internal monologue and narration. And I really like how there can be a bit of a blurring of the line and letting people make their own minds up about that. Is it one? Is it the other? Is it both? I think that's really valuable. I think it's good to have that freedom, that interpretation in a story, especially in something like first person, where sort of by definition every narrator is unreliable to some extent. I, more than anybody else, he is a surprisingly unreliable narrator, but I digress. In third person, I think you can do this, but the problem with doing this is you have to have the camera in a very specific place, which I didn't feel I had, for one, and I thought that was a shame. But also, this is a really picky pet peeve of mine. I feel like if you do this in third, you are out and out forced to use italics. And the amount of italics you would have on the page, if I wanted to do this the way I usually would, so much of the page would be in italics, especially in third, that it would be horrible to look at and it would be unpleasant to read. And it puts me off. I don't like italics. You'll know this if you've read really any of my work, that, Mr. Nakagami has 0 italics in it. Charcoal Rain has 0 italics in it. Count the Stars has italics in it only where strictly and absolutely necessary, because I hate them. I really, really hate them, because it feels to me like I'm telling the reader what to think. And even though that's not what I would be doing in the sort of stream of consciousness third person thing, I struggle to break away from that. I don't like it. I don't like reading it when there's too much of it. Again, I understand italics for emphasis and all of this. I'm not media illiterate. I can respect it when it's done well. But I do think it's also one of the reasons I stopped doing computer drafting and I do things longhand, is because I had too much of an urge to press all the buttons, and I could bold this, I could underline that, I could make that italic and change the font colour, and all of these things could mean something. And I'm just so put off now from doing any of that. It feels like crossing a line into... It's not pretentious, I'm fully aware that I'm a pretentious arsehole, believe me. It's not pretentious, it crosses the line into elitist. And there are a few things I find more annoying than that. So it's a really weird, complicated issue, but I just thought it was a shame, again, to miss all of that internal thought and stream of consciousness in that way. I felt that something was lacking, something that I'd usually have, and again, a bit of complexity and a bit of humanising things. Is this a skill issue? Quite possibly. Is it a camera placement issue? Again, quite possibly. I'm inclined to say it's both of those things, that this is primarily a skill issue, actually, and I just need to work on that. But it was incredibly annoying in the draft. I don't think it would have annoyed me quite so much if everything else wasn't on top. But the combination of everything together just made for a profoundly unenjoyable experience. And I thought that was a real shame, actually. But I also think, on top of all of this, that there's an extremely key reason as to fully why I didn't enjoy this. I think there is an elephant in the room. What's very funny about that, and you can't see this obviously because there's no face cam, is I have a Bruxish plush in my hand. It's like there's an elephant in the room, but there's also a Bruxish plush in my hand, and I think that's exactly the same thing that I just haven't mentioned until now. When hypoxemia was an extremely fresh concept, it was bleeding edge. It was originally this really, really weird low oxygen fever dream. But I never intended to write that. Partly because it was just so damn weird that it was, okay, but this is part video game, this is part Final Fantasy Tactics, this is part Mario Galaxy. Why is Hanzo here at all? It was all kinds of jumbled nonsense, 99% of which has been removed because it is jumbled nonsense that had no business ever being there, even in a fever dream. I never intended to write really anything from it. There are a few bits of world building that I thought were interesting. That's kind of as far as it went. But then I get told by not one, not two, not three, but an entire group of people that I couldn't write fantasy. Not fantasy, not epic fantasy. I just wasn't capable. I don't have the chops to do it. My instantaneous thought was, fuck you. Yes, I can, and I will. Lo and behold, I did. And you know what? I maintain that. Fuck you. I can, and I did. This is the thing. It's a concept that I never really wanted to write, but I workshopped the hell out of it, out of spite, and I workshopped it into something that I genuinely, wholeheartedly think is a really cool idea. But the underlying spite is there, and it's been there the whole time. And I will never look at hypoxemia without remembering that exchange. And without remembering that that is the real reason I wrote this. And I can badge it as, oh, it's part of the Full House, it's part of experimentation, it's in the Joker pack. I can badge it as that all I want, and it's not wrong, it's not false, but we all know the real reason I did it. And I think having spite in the back of your mind permanently, while writing a project that you never intended to write, that encompasses a lot of things that you don't like to write. I don't like to write good versus evil, and I know this by virtue of I've never really done it because it doesn't interest me as a writer. I don't particularly like fantasy as a reader or a writer. I don't like third person as a reader or a writer, particularly. It was in many ways foolish to think I'd ever really enjoy writing this. It's not surprising, is it? So the question is, what now? Going forward. I finished the first draft of Hypoxemia. It's, I don't think, objectively that bad a draft, actually. There are problems, yes. There are definitely some problems in the middle. But I don't feel I have full closure as a fuck you, yes I can. Because it is only in first draft. And I don't think I will, for myself, feel done with that until it's fully edited. Doesn't have to be published, that I don't care about. But a fully edited, clean as possible version of Hypoxemia is what I want. To complete the fuck you I can, but also because I've come this far, it's a bit sunk cost fallacy in the sense of, well, I've got a first draft, editing this isn't going to take very long. It's a bit of a messier first draft than I usually have, but it's, what, 15k? An editing pass on 15k takes, what, a couple hours? And I mean that, it really doesn't take very long. I could whip this into shape in a few days if I wanted to, and when I want to, I will. Because I've got learning to do. You know, there are plenty of things I can still learn from this, if nothing else, about writing in third person, what that looks like, how that feels, how I can make it a bit closer to something I want. Can I write fantasy? Yes. Yes, I can. I've proven that I can write fantasy. And I can write a pretty decent first draft of a fantasy, actually. Have I proven that I can write a fantasy that I want to and enjoy reading? No. That's the threshold that I want to hit, and I don't think I've done my due diligence until that point. Until I feel like I've learned everything I'm going to learn from it, I don't feel like I'm fully done with it. I did have this other very odd feeling as soon as I finished the draft, because I did have this fuck you I can moment. I thought, well, I can write fantasy again, let's immediately write another fantasy project. That was my very first thought, was let's write more, because I can. I can do it, actually. And I do have 2 more fantasy novelettes I've mentioned, Candidate 66 and Eye of Darkness. And having finished Hypoxemia as a draft and had this profoundly odd experience all the way through, it has spurred me on to finish Candidate 66. That's something I actively want to do, and I'm actively excited for it too. And there will be that element of fuck you I can in there. But Candidate 66 predates that by years. It was a concept I had a very long time ago, and it's been sat there for a very long time, and I just put it down. And that's much more what that is to me. Eye of Darkness, however, I started writing Hypoxemia because I didn't want to write that. I wanted to write a fantasy project because I felt like I'd been in my comfort zone for too long. And I thought, I'm going to go full ham the other way. It's going to be Hypoxemia or Eye of Darkness, and I thought, Eye of Darkness sucks, I'm not going to write that. And I think I can say really at this point, beyond reasonable doubt, that I feel exactly the same way now. Eye of Darkness, I think, as a concept, sucks. And I don't want to write it. And I'm probably just not going to at this point, because I don't think I'm going to enjoy it. And I don't know that I'm going to learn that much from it. It might be useful as practice. I might feel differently about that in the future, but that is the distant future at this point. And I do want to keep writing fantasy. I want to get good at it. I want to enjoy it. I want to write fantasy that I want to read, and I want to enjoy the process. But I'll always love dark lit more, I think. But, it's on the periphery of the full house for a reason. It's not what I love, it's never been what I love. Dark lit will always be superior to me, and it's always what I'm going to spend the majority of my time doing. Anyhow, I hope this has been an interesting episode to listen to, and a fun episode, and maybe there's been something really interesting in there in terms of writing craft and how I really had to think about it this time way more than I ordinarily would. I would never usually think about the sort of role that a character must fulfill in order to fill this theme. I would never normally think about that. It's such a weird experience. If you want to read something that I've written that is very much not weird for me, but potentially for you, then you can check out my published work. The link is in the description to read all three of those. That's Mr. Nekagami, Count the Stars, and Charcoal Rain. The latter two are novelettes featured in anthologies. The first is my debut novel, The Determined Ones. They have begun. The second book is coming soon. For what it's worth, they can be read in any order. I use second book simply because that's the second release. It does not matter, you can read that one first if you so wish. But if you do not and you want to read it now, links in the description. And also in the description is where you can find me elsewhere. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and Blue Sky occasionally. Instagram is the home of the podcast. It's the host of the podcast and the sister show. So if you're enjoying the vibe here, if you like what you see, Instagram's the place to go. If you want to hear more about my writing and send me live updates as to whatever I'm up to at the minute, Twitter's the place to go. I also host prompts on there, so jblack21 on there. If you're looking for art and world building and some exclusive snippets, exclusive art, some really interesting different stuff, Pinterest is the place to go, jade_black21 on there. On Blue Sky I do game dev when I make time for game dev, which is not often enough. Occasionally I'm there, jblack21. And if you are published or well on the way, please do get in touch. My email is on screen. I'd love to interview you and be part of your journey. Indie and Self Pub, you're the people I'm looking to hear from, and from now on I am prioritising indie dark lit because there are so few spaces for dark lit, and I'm trying to be the change I want to see. And for what it's worth, no, dark lit does not include dark fantasy in my book. But I have taken up plenty of your time today, so until next time, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like, or commenting, or subscribing. It really does help the channel a lot. All music is done by me. Copyright Jade Black 2025.